Okay, Chapter 2, Video 3, we pick up talking about the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, and we're talking here about freedom of speech, which is the basis of our democratic society, our democratic government. And I think I said this before, but speech, protected speech can be not just what we talk, but any form of communication, including gestures, movements, articles of clothing, and other forms of expressive conduct. Okay, so in order for a action against somebody expressing themselves to be legal and not violative of the First Amendment, it has to serve a compelling state interest, and it must be narrowly drawn to achieve that interest. In other words, it can't be overly broad. It can't, even though it has a legitimate reason or legitimate state interest, if it reaches too far and also has some conduct that isn't legitimate for the government to regulate, then it's going to be struck down by the court if the court believes that it could have been written more narrowly. Okay, so speech is divided into three areas by the Supreme Court. This is their interpretation or application of the First Amendment. We have fully protected speech, limited protected speech, and unprotected speech. So fully protected speech means that you can say it and nobody can stop you from saying it. Examples include political speech. The government cannot prohibit that. So you can say basically whatever you want about the government. Now, in these days and times when we are seeing some self kind of regulation by entities like Facebook, we may have to separate out things like misstatements of fact that mislead the public versus political speech. So keep that in mind. That's a growing area of concern, primarily because of social media. Limited protected speech is content neutral speech. The government cannot prohibit it, but the government can limit it to certain places, times, and manners. For example, the Federal Communications Commission is authorized to prevent channels that are broadcast over airwaves from broadcasting foul or inappropriate, offensive language. Okay, so you've heard of the 7 words that you can't say on TV, for example. That's a limited protected area. Okay, unprotected speech means that the government can have a law that says you can't say this or you can't communicate this. And examples of that are dangerous speech, speech that provokes a violent response. So you can get up on a soapbox and you could say all the negative things you want about the President of the United States that are political. But if you say something like, you guys should be so mad at the president that one of you needs to go and kill him, that is not protected speech. That's provoking a violent response. Other examples: inciting revolutionary overthrow of the government, defamatory language, which we'll talk about when we talk about torts and defamation, child pornography, and obscene speech. So those are some areas that are unprotected. Okay. Social media, the Packington versus State of North Carolina case, where North Carolina passed a law restricting the use of internet or people convicted of sex offenses. Mr. Packington wrote a Facebook post about traffic ticket and was prosecuted under this law. That should be trafficking people. The Supreme Court ruled that the law in this situation was unconstitutional. Okay. The Animal Defense Fund versus Wasden involved an Idaho statute which targeted undercover investigation of either cultural operations and had a recording clause criminalizing the making of an audio and video recordings of an agricultural production facility without the owner's consent. The Ninth Circuit found this to be a violation of the First Amendment. Okay. So we talked about political speech. Corporations also are protected under the First Amendment for political speech. Citizens United is that famous case decided, about 10 years ago now, and it had several holdings. First holding was that campaign contributions are communication or protected speech. Okay? I guess what the court was saying is when you donate money to a candidate, you're making a statement of support of that candidate. Okay? And therefore the First Amendment prevents limits from being placed on independent political expenditures by corporations. In other words, you cannot pass a law that says that corporations can only donate so much money to a political candidate. Okay, that's a very important case that has basically been a standard for elections for the last 10, 20 years. Okay, commercial speech enjoys substantial protection under the First Amendment. The limitation is that for it to be commercial and protected, it cannot be misleading or false. It'll be considered valid if it meets these three criteria. It must seek to implement a substantial government interest, that is, the restriction by the government will be considered to be legitimate if it seeks to implement a substantial government interest, if it directly advances that interest, and it goes no farther than necessary to push the subject. And you can look at the Bad Frog Brewery case as an example of that. Okay, so an example of this area is lawyer advertising. Before the 1970s, lawyers were prohibited by bar associations and sometimes state law from advertising. Some lawyers challenged that. It went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled that lawyer advertising was speech, and it fell into the second category because it is commercial speech, and that lawyers can advertise so long as their advertising is not false or misleading. Okay, so that's the standard. Unprotected speech, we talked about threatening and obscene speech. And we talked about the allowance of restrictions on some speech with regard to time, place, and manner. So, for example, that's why government is allowed to regulate where you have a protest march. They can't stop you from having a protest march, but they can legitimately regulate where, when, and the manner of that if it fulfills a substantial government interest in that regulation. Okay, I'm going to stop here, make sure I have enough bandwidth.